Just want to, before we get started today, also draw your attention to our upcoming program. In 2 weeks, we'll be having Kate Shanley, who is chair of Native American Studies, who will be talking to us about gender issues and research related to Native Americans. So I hope you'll be able to attend 2 weeks from today. Today, I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Herbert Swick, who is Executive Director of the Institute for Medicine and Humanities, which is a joint program of the University of Montana and St. Patrick Hospital here in Missoula. He's also a professor at the University of Montana, where he teaches in the Davidson's Honors College. Currently holds a clinical faculty appointment at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Has a very distinguished career, has his MD degree from Johns Hopkins University, completed training in pediatrics and child neurology, spent 30 years in academic medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin and the University of Kansas School of Medicine as a clinician, among other appointments. So has a distinguished record of authorship of hundreds of articles and abstracts in peer-reviewed professional journals. He's certainly known for the excellent programs that he puts on through the Institute of Medicine and Humanities, and also through his weekly radio broadcast, Legio Medicum, if I pronounced that correctly. Close enough. I never took that. Which is broadcast on Montana Public Radio. Which times it's on? Sunday, 12:15. So, pleased to have Dr. Swick with us here to talk on the topic of selfish or selfless physicians confront academics. Thank you, Dr. Swick.
Thank you, Mark. I learned, as you have noticed, that the LCD projector in this room is rather dim, but we'll see how we can go with things. And it's certainly good to be here this afternoon. In 1967, the U.S. Surgeon General William Stewart confidently announced that we had conquered infectious diseases, that they were no longer a serious threat. So long as remained of human existence, we were done with them. And since then, more than 26 new and serious infectious diseases have erupted. Diseases such as AIDS, and hantavirus, and mad cow disease, and Ebola hemorrhagic fever, and SARS. And epidemics will continue to beset us. And so what I'd like to do today is consider 4 particular epidemic infectious diseases and explore how physicians have confronted them through the years. I'll use these stories largely to entertain, because this is, after all, the lunch hour, but also as a springboard to consider some of the ethical dimensions and the values of medical practice. I will use 2 historic diseases, bubonic plague, the Black Death, and yellow fever, and 2 more contemporary problems, SARS and AIDS. In past times, we had rather colorful names for disease, and now we seem somehow to be reduced to acronyms. It's helpful, I think, to define epidemic, because the word conveys the nature of the diseases that we're going to be talking about today, and suggests the reasons for how people have responded, including physicians, to those diseases. An infectious disease becomes epidemic when it spreads rapidly and extensively, involving many people at the same time. And its unwelcome presence is, as you would suggest from the Greek derivation, truly upon the people. It's something visited upon the people. So it's 1347, and merchant ships from the rich trade routes of the East have docked in Messina, on the sunny shores of the Mediterranean Sea. In addition to silk and spices, the ships carried dead and dying rats and sailors. The Black Death has arrived. And over the next few months, it spreads quickly through Italy, and from there to France and England and Germany. Bubonic plague will devastate Europe for the next 300 years. And during the epidemic outbreaks, 30 to 40% of the European population died. In some cities, the mortality was as high as 80%. The disease was so lethal that people might go to bed well and be dead by morning. Some doctors caught the disease at the patient's bedside and died before the patient did. How did people respond to this sudden catastrophe? I think it's fair to say that the plague did not inspire mutual help. On the contrary, it led to a real breakdown in family structures, to a disruption of civil authority and social systems, to lawlessness and debauchery. Boccaccio, who in his Decameron described the impact of the plague in Florence, Italy, wrote, "One man shunned another, kinsfolk held aloof, brother was forsaken by brother, oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their children to their fate, untended, unvisited, as if they had been strangers." And another contemporary chronicler, Ralph Higdon, wrote in his Polychronicon that in 1361 there was a great human mortality, particularly of men. Their widows, as if degenerate and not restrained by any shame, took as their husbands foreigners and other imbeciles and madmen. In this rather chaotic and lethal environment, city officials abandoned their posts. Priests refused to attend to the ill or to give last rites to the dying. Doctors confronted the very real possibility that they would fall victim to the plague if they tried to treat those suffering from it. Some doctors did remain in plague-infested cities, lancing buboes and making futile efforts to treat the disease with amulets and charms, with herbs such as saffron and pepper and myrrh, or with the best vegetables, which were onions, leeks, and garlic. In 1349, 20 of the 24 physicians in Venice succumbed to the plague. But many physicians took the advice that they offered to others. Quito longe tarde. Flee quickly, stay long, return slowly. And a couple hundred years later, as the plague called the pestilence continued to wreak its havoc, the behavior of physicians had not changed. This was what one German physician advised his colleagues. Clever doctors have 3 golden rules to keep us safe from pestilence. Get out quickly, go a long way, and don't be in a hurry to come back. The last major outbreak of plague occurred in London between 1664 and 1666, and at that time to flee from the crowded cities was still the best advice for those who could afford to do so. But some admonished physicians and others, like public officials, to stay, and this was from William Boghurst's account of the plague of London in 1665. "Every man that undertakes to be of a profession or takes upon him any office must take all parts of it, the good and the evil, the pleasure and the pain. For ministers must preach, captains must fight, physicians attend upon the sick." And in fact, many physicians, while some fled to the country, many physicians did try to stay and help. And I think many of you have seen this sort of garb before. This is the classic dress worn by the physicians during the Plague of London, with the long snout and the heavy robes and so forth. Obviously, it didn't do a whole lot of good. Let me pause here for just a minute and ask what ethical issues or principles are raised in your minds by how physicians responded to bubonic plague. What I'd like to do is simply get your ideas now. We'll list them on the board, and then we'll, rather than discuss them now, come back at the end of the talk and see if we can put them together. So, given what little I've shared with you about the plague, what ideas come to mind as far as ethical issues that might be raised?
When you become a physician, you would take some sort of oath that would be contrary to that.
Okay, so the question of the physician's oath and what might be some components of that oath.
Since you're good.
Beneficence, okay. Do we see that in the plague,
No,
particularly? But we'll list it just in case.
They seem to respond out of fear and essentially abandon their patients.
Okay, so the question of fear is certainly an interesting one. And while fear is not an ethical principle, it plays into some important things, I think. Mark?
Well, the dilemma of self-preservation versus doing all for your patients.
Yes. Okay. Why don't we, since we got started a little bit late, leave it at that and we'll come back. It's 1981. Doctors across the country are beginning to see signs of a strange new disease. Young men for the majority of the early patients are men, are developing severe, often fatal infections and developing a rare type of skin cancer known as Kaposi sarcoma. Their immune systems are no longer protecting them. AIDS has arrived. And healthcare professionals, physicians and nurses and others, are fearful. Again, fear as a driving experience. In 1985, at the Johnson City Medical Center, which is located in eastern Tennessee, when the first patient seen at that hospital died of AIDS after being on a mechanical ventilator for 4 or 5 days to help his breathing, some suggested that the ventilator, a fairly expensive piece of equipment, be taken out in the backyard and buried. The societal response to AIDS, of course, was colored by the fact that many of the patients were gay men and IV drug abusers. And there were those who argued that AIDS was God's righteous punishment for sinful behavior. Hence, those with AIDS somehow deserved the disease. It was their fault, which meant by corollary that they did not deserve to be treated. And interestingly, the medical response, the physician's response to this new and rather frightening epidemic was mixed. Some physicians refused to care for patients. They feared somehow that AIDS would come into their office or bring into their office undesirable patients, and that they themselves may become infected with AIDS. At this point, the cause and the means of transmission of the disease were not yet known. Others in the medical profession simply turned their backs on the disease, hoping somehow that it would simply go away. For whatever reason, geographic location, AIDS was more prominent in big cities than it was out in smaller towns or in the center of the country, or the type of practice or patient population. Physicians figured they were not likely to see patients with AIDS, so maybe the head in the sand approach would work and it would simply go away. But another reason physicians feared AIDS quickly became apparent. The disease, it was said, rendered doctors impotent. Most American physicians were not used to dealing with diseases they couldn't cure, or at least understand and treat. But AIDS was different. Nothing in the contemporary experience of doctors had looked anything like it. One doctor said she felt like a travel agent for death because there was nothing she could do but help patients who were on their way to dying. But some patients, or some doctors, did not shy away from patients with AIDS. Some were, I think, actually drawn by the excitement of confronting a new disease, and others were committed to helping underserved segments of the population. As the AIDS epidemic exploded through the early and mid-1980s, more and more physicians found themselves reevaluating the concept of caring for patients. And as Gerald Oppenheimer has noted in his history of the AIDS epidemic, they came to an understanding that being a doctor involves much more than giving medication and ordering tests. It made them take a glimpse at the soul of medicine. You can heal when you cannot cure. I think many doctors discovered that. And as we look back on the first 20, 25 years of AIDS, I think that certainly has been true in many such situations. But again, let me ask, what ethical principles or issues arise in your mind about how physicians responded to AIDS, particularly in the early years? Anyone?
It seems like there's a question of how to treat someone with a disease that you don't understand.
Okay.
Just the unknown of not.
Let me just proceed that by unknown.
Okay.
How do you approach a patient whose disease you don't know anything about?
Well, I think the principle of justice plays a role.
Okay. In what sense?
Well, my guess is that it would depend on where you had AIDS, would depend on what sort of care or treatment you got. And so.
That's right. If you were in San Francisco, it may have been different than if you were in Topeka, Kansas. Other issues or ideas come to mind with HIV/AIDS?
If you can't treat the patient, you can support it.
Okay. So Cure versus support.
Just discrimination.
Okay. Any others, or shall we leave it there? Okay, good. It's 1793, August. Philadelphia, which, as some of you may know, is built on low, swampy land, is the hottest and most humid and dampest of all the cities along the American seacoast, hotter even than Charleston or Savannah. Wharves jut out into the river and cut off high tides, so that cut off the current, so that at high tides all sorts of debris, rotting debris and other things are deposited in the mud. In swamps and in marshes lie pools of stagnant water. And a ship arrives at one of those wharves from the West Indies, bearing mosquitoes carrying yellow fever. And rather quickly, an epidemic of yellow fever spreads through the city. People lie dead in the streets, untended sometimes for several days. And by this time, by 1793, the nature of infectious diseases was still not understood. Although doctors by this time did have some concept of contagion, the idea that disease could be spread from one person to another. They thought it was due to foul air or to miasmas arising from these swampy areas, or even by effluvia, if you will, rising from patients themselves. Sick people were known to be dangerous by this time. And the most prominent physician in Philadelphia at that time was Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And it was Rush, as most of us I think probably in this room know, who would a few years later advise Captain Meriwether Lewis about what medications to take on his westward voyage of discovery. And one of Benjamin Rush's favorite treatments was purging with mercury. And he had something he called, or became called, blue thunderbolts. They were little mercury capsules that were a very effective purgative. And thanks to Rush's blue thunderbolts, we've been able to pinpoint the exact site of Traveler's Rest down toward Lolo from the high content in the mercury soil 200 years later. But that's another story. So let me take you back to 1793. When yellow fever gripped the city of Philadelphia, Rush advised everyone who was able to leave. I know of but one certain preventative of the disorder, he said, and that is to keep at a distance from infected persons and places. Benjamin Rush sent his wife and children to Princeton, but he stayed behind. As he recalled later in a book he wrote accounting for yellow fever, in 1796 he wrote a book about this. And he recalled in this book, and I quote, "I cast a look, I then thought most probably a final one, towards my dear family, for I had resolved to perish with my fellow citizens rather than dishonor my profession or religion by abandoning the city. I can never forget the anguish of soul with which in this awful situation I wrung my hands, and I believe I wept aloud." Rather colorful and perhaps a bit self-serving, but nevertheless I think it sort of says what Rush was feeling. And in 1793, yellow fever defied understanding. All known remedies failed. Rush bled and purged his patients, and he wrapped them in vinegar-soaked blankets and then threw buckets of cold water on them. Didn't do much. But he wrote a letter to his wife on August 30th, 1793, after the epidemic had raged for about 2 weeks. "Another night and morning have been added to my life. I am preparing to set off my daily round of duty and feel heartily disposed to say with Jabez, 'Oh, that the hand of the Lord may be with me, not only to preserve my life, but to heal my poor patients.'" There were 10 physicians practicing in Philadelphia at this time. Of the 10, 2 fled the city. 4 others contracted yellow fever and died, while the last 4, including Benjamin Rush, were seriously ill with yellow fever, but recovered. And as an interesting aside, some prominent citizens of the city turned against Rush during this time because he was arguing that yellow fever somehow had originated locally, that it was something about the conditions of Philadelphia that made this disease erupt into an epidemic. And the merchants of the city and some of the prominent politicians were very upset that somehow Philadelphia's reputation would be destroyed, because it was presumably a fairly healthy city, and they were afraid that commerce would be hurt and it would drive Congress away, because Congress then was meeting in Philadelphia. But Rush persisted, and against his critics he said, "Truth in science as morals never did any harm." Let me jump ahead by about a century. In the 1890s, yellow fever was still a real problem in subtropical climate. You would see cases of it every year in the southern U.S. states, and certainly throughout the Caribbean. And the disease had foiled an earlier attempt to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. By this time, 1890s, it was known that yellow fever was an infectious disease, because they had proved the nature of infectious diseases by then. But the ways in which it was transmitted were still unknown. So the Army sent a yellow fever commission to Cuba, headed by Walter Reed, and this is an article from the Havana Post in June of 1900 that talks about the commission's role, which was to study all tropical disease, but to endeavor to study yellow fever as it has never been studied before. And indeed they did. To ascertain how yellow fever could be passed from one person to another, Reed and his team sought volunteers who would expose themselves to the frequently fatal disease. Volunteers would get $100 in gold just for volunteering. If they got the disease, they would get another $100 in gold, plus the best medical care available. And it was interesting, they sought volunteers largely from the Hispanic population of Havana and environs, but also from the troops that were down there, the U.S. troops. And several active duty soldiers volunteered. One of them, a young fellow by the name of John Kissinger, a young private, refused his $100, saying that he was doing this, quote, solely in the interest of humanity and the cause of science. And it's of note, I think, that the Yellow Fever Commission was the first research group to use consent forms in their research. They actually got the volunteers to sign a consent form before they would subject them to yellow fever. One theory at that point about the cause of the disease was that yellow fever could be passed by mosquitoes, an idea that the Washington Post scorned as, quote, the silliest beyond compare. Another theory was that it could be transmitted by fomites, such as articles of clothing or bed linens. And to test this idea, the commission built a wooden building, which they called the Infected Clothing Building. And it was constructed to preclude good air circulation and to keep out mosquitoes. And then they heated this room to 90 degrees, and volunteers carried in boxes of sheets and blankets and pillowcases and other linen that had been contaminated by contact with cases of yellow fever. And these were filthy with urine and feces and vomitus and all the rest of it. And they shook these out and then made their beds with these sheets and crawled in to go to sleep. Several of the volunteers even slept in night clothes that had been worn by patients with yellow fever, several of whom had died. And none of these folks became ill. Reed's team found that yellow fever could be transmitted by injecting blood from patients into healthy volunteers, and by asking volunteers to let themselves be bitten by mosquitoes that had taken a blood meal from an infected patient. They finally proved that, in fact, it was the mosquitoes that transmitted the disease. And a number of volunteers became gravely ill. A few died. And there were a couple of physicians who were among the victims. Jesse Lazier, 34 years old, an assistant acting surgeon with the Army, led the effort among the scientists to transmit yellow fever by the bite of the mosquitoes. He had charge of that part of the experiment. And in a small pocket notebook, Lazier recorded first his efforts to try to breed and raise mosquitoes and to get them infected with the disease, and then to get them to bite volunteers. And he did 11 experiments, fairly carefully designed, and the last 2 resulted in full-blown cases of yellow fever. So Lazier got very excited. He said in a letter to his wife on September 8th, "I rather think I am on track of the real germ." 17 days later, he was dead, because he had himself bitten by an infected mosquito, and he died of yellow fever. So again, Let me ask, what ethical issues arise in this sort of setting with yellow fever?
Seems to me self-sacrifice, sacrifice oneself for the benefit of many.
Okay, good. Here we have self-preservation, now we have self-sacrifice. What else?
And a selflessness on the part of Private Kissinger.
Yeah, he was certainly very selfless, wasn't he? As was, I would argue, Jesse Razier.
There still might be a justice issue in terms of how volunteers were induced to volunteer.
Okay. $100, and if you get sick, we'll give you another 100. That was big money in those days.
There was also informed consent mentioned for the
Right.
first time. So some respect for autonomy.
Right. And I'm going to put informed in quotes, if you don't mind. But certainly the idea of getting consent of volunteers to do this. One of the earlier instances of human experimentation. But the idea that they asked, I think, was rather interesting.
Courage.
Courage. Let's put courage up there. Okay, it's early 2003, and the news is filled with stories of a new disease erupting in China and Southeast Asia, a rapidly spreading, often fatal epidemic. SARS, an acronym for the severe acute respiratory syndrome. I think a forceful reminder that we all ought to be interested in what breaks out across the world, because disease now can spread quickly across national borders and oceans and other natural barriers. And with only a couple of months of the time SARS appeared first in Vietnam and in southern China, it had spread to more than 24 countries throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas. And major cities, you'll recall, like Singapore and Toronto and Hong Kong, were suddenly off limits, isolated from the global community. And the response to SARS was sometimes rather draconian. Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, quarantined people, even entire buildings, if they were thought to have been exposed to the virus. And the Singapore authorities installed video cameras in the homes or apartments of suspect carriers, and then placed random phone calls to these people. And the quarantined person had to take and report his temperature while being watched on the video monitor. If no one was home when they placed the call, then that person was fitted with an electronic monitor, like the ankle bracelets that you think about being used in house arrests. And his every movement was tracked. China threatened anyone who broke quarantine with long prison terms. Even the death sentence. Breaking quarantine in China might merit the death sentence. But was SARS really all that bad? What was all the fuss about, after all? It erupted in February of 2003, and by July it was over with. The World Health Organization reported finding 8,422 cases of SARS worldwide, with 916 deaths, just over 10% fatality rate. Much lower death rate, say, than bubonic plague or AIDS. Why was it that SARS got so much attention? One factor certainly was the very rapid transmission of information thanks to modern technology of communications. And the media loved the dramatic headlines on the evening news as much as anything else. But another was the economic impact. It's been estimated that SARS cost the global economy about $30 billion in just 3 months. The SARS epidemic also, I think, revealed the importance of good public health systems. Where good public health systems existed, the disease was quickly recognized and quickly contained. But when the authorities tried to conceal the disease, as they did in China for several weeks, Chinese government simply refused to acknowledge or to report SARS cases accurately, and this certainly impeded efforts by the World Health Organization and others to define and to contain the epidemic. But let me mention one other legacy of SARS. It served, I think, perhaps more than any of the other diseases we've talked about today, sort of as a testament to some healthcare values. This is Carlo Urbani, an Italian physician working for the World Health Organization. And he was the first to recognize this new respiratory infection that became known as AIDS. He was working at the Vietnam French Hospital in Hanoi, Vietnam. He identified SARS. He established quarantine for the early cases, one of the very important steps in controlling it. And he refused to leave his patients. People kept saying to him, you need to turn this over to somebody else, but he wouldn't do so. And in less than 4 weeks, he died of SARS. And this is, I think, in distinct contrast to the flee quickly and come back slowly response that we saw with bubonic plague. And Urbani was not alone. Except for the index case, all of those who died from SARS in Vietnam were physicians and nurses, except for the first patient. In Hong Kong, over 1/4 of the over 1/4 of the cases were among healthcare workers, and in Canada, 65% of the cases of SARS were in physicians and nurses. And so physicians and other healthcare professionals by this time were staying around and continued to care for patients with SARS, despite what turned out occasionally to be fairly significant personal risk. So it's time again for that now familiar question. What about some of the ethical questions or issues that come up with SARS?
Well, it was an invasion of privacy on the part of authorities.
In what sense?
Well, in monitoring people and restricting their
Right. Yeah, if you were
freedom, basically.
thought of having been exposed to SARS, how about having to stay in your apartment and answer the phone with the television monitor on? What else?
Restriction of liberty and for those who have it and suspect.
Okay.
Well, again, we see this issue of selflessness on the part of the physician or doctor.
Okay.
There's the question of information and how various governments handle getting information out to citizens and
Okay.
And the role of the media.
Yeah, were the media responsible in the way they hyped this? Just for the advantage of trying to capture the population on the evening news. Which is hardly medical ethics, but I think it raises some interesting questions. So let me go back. I wanted to write these on the board and list them because I think you'll see some common themes that erupt through these 4 diseases, and you'll see some differences as well. But let me work both from what you've said here, and this is a chance, I think, to engage in a dialogue, so I invite certainly your comments and questions, but with PowerPoint, you always have to have the slides made in advance, so let me run through some of these and review them. Talked about fear under particularly plague, and you saw the same thing with AIDS. When AIDS first broke out, people had no idea what in the world was going on. So what about physicians acting in the face of uncertainty and of an unknown danger, or in the face of a known danger? By the time yellow fever was studied by the Reed Commission, they knew this was a dangerous disease. Certainly in the early weeks of SARS, as people began to see the patients with SARS, they recognized a certain danger. So it gets back to that question of the oath that came up very early. Do physicians have a duty to act in the face of sometimes problematic situations? And if they do have a duty, whence does it come? What's the origin of that duty? Is it?
Well, it's amazing to me that people that died of SARS, the health workers, didn't they wear masks or garb or something and take, you know,
Oh, yeah.
they did that?
They did that, and you know, they had what they called universal precautions, and quite frankly, they wore stuff that made them look like an updated version of that 17th century English physician, you know, all garbed up. But despite that, there comes a time in the care where the healthcare workers are going to be exposed. The patient first comes into the emergency room or first gets up to the ward, and there's some period of time, or maybe there's a break in isolation during the treatment of the patient. But it's a good point. They were trying to do respiratory isolation, as we call it, universal precautions, but it didn't always happen just at the right time.
Because I can see trying to practice in those situations, but at the same time, the self-preservation thing has to be there as well, I would think, and maybe it's a balance.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And you know, the way I have put some of what, and tried to encapsulate some of what you folks have identified, is that idea of conflicting obligations. In a recent article in Ethics in Healthcare, John Moskop, who's a bioethicist from Virginia, pointed out that virtually all practicing physicians assume multiple obligations to patients' families, to their own families, to themselves, and to society at large. And sometimes those obligations come into conflict. So you've got the obligation on the one hand, the duty to treat, but you've got the conflicting obligation of self-preservation, which can be a fairly vigorous one at times. And you know, there are often conflicts between the multiple obligations that they have.
Where does the Hippocratic Oath play out here with regard to the obligations?
Okay.
Doesn't that supersede everything as far as the responsibilities and duties the physician has to uphold the oath?
Good question. To what extent does the Hippocratic Oath supersede all of this and really define these things? And the Hippocratic Oath, perhaps the most honored and certainly the oldest of a number of physician oaths that have come up. You have others through history that have iterated much the same principle. And if you read it carefully, it doesn't say much about that particular question. It talks about the responsibilities of physicians in a number of ways to treat patients. One of the common misunderstandings, one of the very important concepts is primum non nocere, first do no harm, the idea of non-maleficence. That doesn't show up in the Hippocratic Oath. The concept of beneficence does, doing good, but not necessarily to avoid harm. And what we see today as what we recognize as biomedical ethics today really is a fairly new invention as if you will, as a structured discipline. And it emerged from Georgetown University only in the late 60s and early 1970s, partly or largely as a consequence of some of the increases in medical technology and science. So the idea of a patient autonomy is a relatively new concept, and one that is true with Western biomedical tradition, but not still around other portions of the world. And so the Hippocratic Oath, while it's a very important concept, doesn't address things in as much detail as you might expect it to. And it talks about obligations of a physician, but not necessarily conflicting obligations. A word that didn't appear, but is I think inherent in some of these things, is that sense of altruism. And you see that, I think, with physician behavior in all of these, to a certain extent, perhaps with the exception of plague, but certainly that sense of altruism which came to the fore in physicians who would come up and treat AIDS patients in the early days because they were interested in working with an underserved population or a group of patients. You certainly saw it in SARS. You saw it as well, I think, with Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia when he refused to leave the city and go with his wife and kids to Princeton. Beneficence was mentioned, and it certainly is there. You saw that with some physicians as early as the Black Death of Europe in the 14th century. It wasn't identified again with those other ones, but I think that sense of trying to do good, you certainly could see in various things I shared with you with some of these others. One of the important things, I think, and it comes again into this conflict between self-preservation and self-sacrifice, the selfish, the selfless, if you will. And that's the responsibility, I think, of the physician to subordinate her interest to the interest of the patients. And again, you see that vividly with Urbani. You see it vividly with some of the physicians in the early AIDS epidemic. You saw it, I think, again with Rush, particularly in Philadelphia. His advice, get out of Dodge, folks, get out of town. And yet he refused to leave. He wanted to stay behind. That whole question, yeah.
Well, I'm going back to subordinating self-interest, and I can understand it, but it seems to me kind of a changing of the effect, or the double effect, in the sense that, yes, it may be in interest of those patients, but if the only physician in town dies, there are a lot of other sick folk. And so if a significant portion of the physicians and nurses staff in Vietnam die because of this, there are a lot of other sick people who get no care at all.
Yeah. It's a very good point. And how do you...
Yeah, I mean, it's a dilemma.
It's a dilemma, that's right. And how do you address that? And I wouldn't point to SARS in Vietnam necessarily, because obviously there were other workers there. But think of Philadelphia. 10 physicians at the time in Philadelphia in 1793. That was all there were. And 2 of them fled. 4 died of yellow fever, and 4 were sick. There is a very poignant set of correspondence, a letter from a merchant in the city whose daughter developed yellow fever. And he sent a letter with a messenger pleading for Benjamin Rush to come. Rush at that time was sick with yellow fever, he couldn't go. And so he sent back someone else, and the daughter died, the guy got yellow fever, and there's another letter written by this merchant, please come yourself. He didn't know that Rush had yellow fever at that time and couldn't make it. And it turned out that both the merchant and his daughter died of the disease. So that's an issue, a serious issue, because it decimated the role. One thing that happened in Philadelphia, let me just mention, because it's an interesting sidebar to that. In addition to physicians, there were other healers, and some of them tried to step to the plate, some of them didn't. But 2 that really rose to the occasion, interestingly, were 2 blacks who had been freed slaves and had moved to Philadelphia to try to set up some sort of a little business. I forget what it was. And they stayed behind and brought with them what they knew of, if you will, the herbal treatments for yellow fever. They had probably both had it when they were kids down south. And so they did not become sick, but they became very active in trying to reach out and help this population of Philadelphia at that time. And their herbs may not have done much good, but they certainly didn't do as much harm as Rush's bleeding and purging, probably, and throwing buckets of cold water on patients. But, that's a good point, and it is a dilemma sometimes. That whole question of informed consent, which came up with yellow fever for the first time. And then that sense of non-maleficence, primum non nocere, first do no harm. You don't see that much in any of these stories, but then they're not supposed to be a comprehensive survey of biomedical ethics. And finally, an important one, that sense of justice, which again was identified in several of these diseases, and I think is exemplified by some of the situations that emerged with these various epidemic diseases. We have exactly 12 seconds for questions and comments. Yeah.
I mean, this is a historical one because I'm not aware of it. What eventually brought the Black Plague to an end? I mean,
It just sort of petered out. There were waves of epidemics every 12 to 20 to 25 years. And among the things that probably slowly improved, it was more common in crowded urban cities and situations of poor hygiene and rats and so forth. What stopped the London plague in 1664-65 was the Great Fire of 1666 of London. I mean, that killed enough rats that it really got rid of it. But I think from there on, it still every once in a while broke up, but the huge epidemics of it sort of settled down. Comments? Yeah, Lauren.
I'm just curious about this radio show of yours.
Mhm.
How long is it?
It's a 15-minute program,
It's 12:15 on Sunday.
12:15 on Sundays, Collegium Medicum, yeah. No, this Sunday, because they're in their pledge drive. This is a public radio week, so it will not be on this Sunday. That doesn't mean you can't call in and make your pledges, though, to Montana Public Radio. Anything else? Last minute comments or questions?
Just also with AIDS, an issue of contact tracing and invasion of privacy.
Right.
The idea of how much should be private versus in the interest of public health, not
Yeah.
restricting liberties and violating.
Yeah, and that's another fascinating story because when I was in clinical practice, there was a requirement that if we saw a sexually transmitted disease or another communicable disease, it might be mumps or measles, but certainly when we saw a case of syphilis or gonorrhea or any of these other sexually transmitted diseases, we were required by law to report that to the public health authorities. And when AIDS first came out, it quickly became not a medical issue, but a political issue. And it quickly got to a point where one, presumably for patient privacy, could not report AIDS. And it was a very bizarre, almost surreal experience for those of us who, for years, had been used to reporting cases of sexually transmitted diseases. And that was key because it allowed the public health officials to chase contacts and to, manage to somehow control. And you couldn't do that with AIDS. You were prohibited from reporting cases of AIDS or HIV. And it was a complete reversal. So that question you raised is a good one.
Just have one comment. It's
Yeah.
interesting that during the plague in Europe, it was about the time that the Renaissance arose and flourished. So life did go on to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I can, I'll make an argument, which is another time, that in fact the plague contributed to the Renaissance. It was the early stages of the plague that really made the Renaissance come alive in Italy. Okay, thank you, folks.